Emotional distance and intellectual distance are not the same thing. I'll say like the really unpopular thing, like founders who outwork others are more successful. That's a fact. We can like dress it up all that we want, but like the truth is you do have to be pretty obsessed with your business to get something off the ground, whether you're a solopreneur or building a business that's big scale, lots of employees. I think that's not the same as having your self-worth attached to the performance. But this goes back to the 85% fun thing again. Like, if you are not enjoying 80 to 85% of the way you are spending your working hours and you are lucky enough to have a choice, you should make a different choice.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks. On this show, I interview world-class people about why your work matters and how your work can help you become the leader and the person that you were made to be. My goal is to do the research necessary to ask questions that have never been asked so that my guests can tell their stories in a way that they've never been told on any other show. For you as a listener, I hope that these stories will inspire you to find work that matters and to make a positive impact in your community, in your family, and on the world at large. My guest today is Kieran Snyder. Kieran is the co-founder and former CEO of a company called Textio, where she's been at the forefront of the artificial intelligence revolution since before most of us had ever even heard of AI as a thing. Kieran is an incredible leader that raised over $40 million in her startup journey, and she is one of the exceptional but rare people who has built both equitable and high-performing teams in her career. In this conversation, we talk about how she built the courage to make the hard but necessary decision to step down as CEO of Textio after reaching a point of burnout, what her process has been like to bounce back from there. We talk about how she went from academia to the forefront of AI at the beginning of her career, and so much more in between. As a listener, I hope you'll take away lessons on how to lead teams effectively, how to build companies that provide value in the world, what it's like to develop and foster young female leaders and why she does that through both her work and her coaching of girls basketball. And maybe most interestingly, how Kieran takes surprising but true data and turns it into compelling stories about what it's like to show up to work every day through her newsletter, which is called Nerd Processor. I think there's going to be something for everyone in this episode because Kieran has got such a wonderful and interesting breadth of experience in her background. So without further ado, let's get to it. My conversation with Kieran Snyder. Snyder, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm so excited to see you and be here.
Great to have you here. I thought we might start with an 8th grade science project. And I wondered if you might tell us the story of what that 8th grade science project was and kind of how it reflected who you were and who you've become since then.
I have 2 science projects I did in 8th grade, so now I have to reconstruct which one might be the better story. So probably the best one. My dad was a big subscriber to a variety of science magazines, Scientific American, Science Itself, Nature. And my dad is 85 next week and still running his own electrical engineering company quite actively.
Incredible.
Yeah, so he was kind of like a science nerd forever. And he read this article about in the April edition of Science or Scientific American, I don't remember which one, about the first computer having been discovered recently by archaeologists, and it was a ropes and pulleys device. And it was made by a little-known tribe in South America called Apraful, Apraphul. And my dad was like, this would be so cool if you would recreate it for your science fair. Like they gave all the schematics, like you could build it. And so I thought that was amazing. And it was just a really simple computer you built on like a big piece of plywood with ropes and pulleys, and it added. Like it was a simple addition machine. And it was really cool. And I won the science fair. And then the May issue of the magazine came out and revealed there had never been any such computer. It was an April Fool's joke. But I still won the science fair, and we still built a very basic ropes and pulleys computer that added. So I guess win-win in the end. But yeah, we got taken in by an April Fool's issue of the magazine.
That is pretty hilarious, actually.
Yeah.
You were no stranger to winning things at the time. I understand we won some writing competitions and some other things back then. These things seem to be reflective of your parents and the fact that dad is an engineer, mom's a writer. And I wonder just now, as you look back at the course of your career up to this point, how their career paths and their way of leading you and parenting you shaped you into the leader you've become.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some pros and some cons in there. Like from a purely interest-based perspective, yeah, my dad is an engineer. Actually, as a matter of fact, he took a sabbatical from the college where he was an adjunct professor and taught my high school math and science classes, which was like good, but like not that awesome when I was a teenager. He's a pretty good teacher, but like,
It's like sweet in hindsight, but also
yeah,
a
I mean,
bummer when
it,
you're
it
that
was
age.
sweet in terms of my AP test scores at the time, but like pretty mortifying overall. And my mom was a writer. Yeah. So she was a creative writer. In fact, my mom didn't go to college at all until after I was born. I remember her college graduation as one of my early memories, and I had just about
Wow.
started school. And then she went and got a master's in creative writing at NYU. I grew up in New Jersey. When I was a middle school and high school student, she did like a night program there. And then my dad started his company when I was 7. So around this time, like elementary school into middle school, high school, I watched both of my parents pursue things that were hard, I guess. Like my mom had been a stay-at-home mom, wasn't really encouraged to go to college by her family. Her brothers got more of the opportunities than she did. And so I watched my mom go to college. I watched my dad start a company. I watched my mom then go to grad school. And so it's true that I inherited a lot of their interests. You know, I ultimately studied linguistics and math in college. So it was like a little bit of science, a little bit of writing, a little bit of language. But I think probably it was more impactful watching them try hard things. And that company my dad started is still the company that I mentioned that he's running today. My mom went on to write her first novel when I was in high school and the beginning of college. And so, all this said, I never intended to be a writer. I never intended to be an entrepreneur. And when we started Textio, I had just turned 40 and I had no intention of starting a company. I had at that point built a surprising tech career, surprising because I didn't plan to be in technology. And when I told my dad, he was like, "Well, I've been waiting for you to get around to this." I was like, "Oh, I guess you knew," but I at some level, it must sort of like seeped in, you know?
Mm. What an awesome response for him to say that he had been waiting on it versus, those conversations can go a lot of different ways with parents where they can get scared for you or discourage you or just what a fruitful way to respond to that.
That's true. Yeah.
That's pretty
My
awesome.
dad is never one who misses the chance to say, "I told you so." So that's the other way to see it.
That's funny. That actually reflects some of your research that we'll get to eventually in Nerd Processor, the whole I told you so thing and how that comes out at work, in this case with the parent. One thing I've always wondered about your background is, it's very well known, and the people who know you, that you have a PhD in linguistics from University of Pennsylvania. What does that course of study look like? Like, what are you actually studying as you get that kind of degree in linguistics?
Yeah. So it's not a homogenous field, right? If you ask somebody what it's like to study physics, probably a lot of us took physics in high school. So you have a basic idea of what you're doing, or you ask somebody, they're studying literature, you have a basic idea of what they're doing. Linguistics is a really broad field. So at sort of the mathematical science end of the spectrum, you might be studying a lot of computer science or logic. There's a lot of overlap with philosophy. You're looking at symbolic representations of language and the ways that that can be represented with computers, right? That's one side of the field. The other side of the field is much closer to the humanities. So a lot of people might enter linguistics from having majored in a foreign language, and they get interested in how languages work, or maybe education or sociology, right? They're interested in how language and society interrelate. The particular place where I studied linguistics made you do all of it. So Penn's program was and is probably the most famous in the world for how interdisciplinary it is. So there's no way to study linguistics there without doing some psychology, some computer science, some philosophy, I guess you could probably get by without doing some literature, but a lot of people come into the program with that background. So any given semester as an undergrad, I probably had courses in a spectrum of those areas. By the time I was in grad school, I was focusing more on the analytical and symbolic side of the spectrum. So my particular focus was in natural language processing, which turns out to have been a good bet. At the time, it wasn't clear, but it really, really varies. I have classmates who are teaching writing programs at universities today. I have classmates who went on and did speech pathology or English as a second language. And then I have lots of classmates who ended up in technology. And weirdly, a whole bunch of us ended up starting tech companies. In
Oh,
my
interesting.
cohort, there were probably like 12 or 13 students that were either my year or a year above and below that we were all kind of together in seminars. 5 of us went on to start tech companies, which is super weird for academic linguistics
Yeah, no
programs. That's
kidding. What do
very,
you
very
attribute
unusual.
that to?
I attribute that to us having been next door to Wharton School of Business, which none of us took any classes in, avoided like the plague. Fun fact, Elon Musk was in my college dorm. But like I attribute it to something about that environment incentivizing collaborations with industry and in
Mm,
particularly business. Now I sort of regret that I never took any courses in the business school. Would have been really useful. But
you've done okay though.
yeah, I did okay. I built it by trial by fire, right? But yeah, it's so strange. We talk about it all the time, how many of us ended up entrepreneurs.
It's fascinating how you just get these pods of people like that throughout time and history and everything. You'll just see these pods crop up. And it's interesting that it's a common phenomenon that gets applied across a lot of different areas of life and business and everything. So just a fascinating thing that it happened in a little clump there. You mentioned natural language processing and it being a happy little accident that turned out to be a really good bet. I wondered if you just might say more about that, maybe especially for folks who aren't as familiar with why that was the case.
Yeah. So going a little bit deeper into sort of the philosophy and methodology where I was coming of age professionally when I was a student, Penn was really, really famous for empirical approaches to studying language, which meant, you could go to a place like MIT, where Noam Chomsky built his empire, right? And they are the most famous in the world for people doing theoretical linguistics and a set of related theoretical computer science activities. Penn is really different. Penn was shaped by a guy named William Labov, who is still alive. He's like got to be about 100 now. Like he's
Wow.
still researching, by the way. So I guess my dad has like 15 years to catch up there.
Keep it
But
going.
but
Yeah.
he invented this field called sociolinguistics, which is where you look at how language varies by social group and how language might be used in various sociological contexts as, indicating who belongs or who doesn't belong, and looking at like class mobility and a variety of things like that. The only way to do sociolinguistics is to collect data about what's really happening, right? Pretty different than like computer science, where you can just deal with things with symbolic logic. And so the whole program there was about collecting real data. And then you analyze those big corpora of language you're creating and you find interesting patterns. So like my very nerdy dissertation looked at when you might say, I gave Barrett the book, contrasted with I gave the book to Barrett. It turns out there's a whole bunch of rules about that, even though they mean the same thing, right? I wrote a whole bunch about that in different languages and how children learn it. And the way I did that is I collected lots and lots of data, right? So back to natural language processing, fundamentally, this is a discipline that grows when you have the combo of computer science and this really, really empirical approach to language. So you look at lots and lots of written language. In my case, I didn't really work with speech as much as written language. And you start trying to find patterns that you could teach a computer to recognize. So if I say, I go back to, I gave Barrett the book versus I gave the book to Barrett, you might not consciously know the difference between those two, but you absolutely use them in predictable ways. Well, if I can find what those patterns are, then I can teach a computer to produce language that sounds a lot like you would sound, right? When you're subconsciously choosing one or the other. So natural language processing is when you're looking at What do people do that they might not be aware of? Can you extract those patterns and teach a computer to recognize it or produce it?
Mm. And so in a world where AI is much more prominent and we're talking to computers a lot more and using them for things like writing in a lot more contexts, it becomes really, really valuable to know something about this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think my cohort invented the current moment, right? Like I think my classmates, my cohort helped bring this about. So I'm a little glib in saying it was serendipitous, but obviously like we all came up together, this group. I started a company that helped create this, right? But I think the moment was right if you look at what was happening with the speed and cost of compute, which was starting to make it possible to analyze lots and lots of data at large. The presence of the internet meant that there's now masses and masses of written text that anybody can get access to very quickly. Turns out very controversially, if you look at a bunch of IP rights lawsuits, right, going on, New York Times, OpenAI as an example.
Yeah.
So the preconditions were there. And in fact, when I was a student, the name of the game was whoever had access to the best annotated corpora could do the best research. And that is still true. We didn't steal them at that time. We paid people for, but I remember one of our, the corpuses we used the most was this tree bank corpus, which like we got people to agree to have their phone calls recorded. And if they agreed to contribute, we would pay, not we, I was a student, but the university would pay people if they would have their phone calls recorded. And then we had access to all of that. And that became a really significant corpus for us as grad students.
This is so cool because I'm seeing all of the threads now that we were going to pull on anyways, but the beginnings of some of them for so much of the work that you've done since then, and even the writing that you do now, is using the same kind of methodology of gathering corpus of information, processing it, understanding what's happening within it, and then sharing the learnings from it. Could say that that's like the whole thesis of Nerd Processor, which is where you write about many of these fascinating topics at work. And a little bit of politics here. And this past season, that was a whole fascinating thing. So you ended up in technology, and I'm curious how you ended up there, because you said that that wasn't necessarily a path that would be, a sure thing for someone coming out of a linguistics program. What was the turning point that led you into technology, that you ended up in Microsoft and Amazon? What got you there?
I needed a job. So I was going to be a professor. The final year of my dissertation, I was in Philadelphia. I moved to Seattle for 1 year. Fun fact, I still live here 22 years later. But I moved here for 1 year. I was dating somebody who lived here at the time, and I was studying some child language development stuff. And I found a school here that was willing to let me work with the 4 and 5-year-olds for a year. And so it was kind of a win-win. And I started applying to academic jobs as you would. And I got a couple, which is hard. There's not a lot of academic jobs. And I didn't want to go to those jobs. Didn't want to go where they were. Wasn't that excited about it. Did not know what I wanted to do instead, because I had literally never worked outside of academia. Like all of my practical experience was teaching and research. So I spent a year writing. I said I didn't want to be a writer, but I spent a year writing, running out of money. And then I had a friend who was at Microsoft who was like, you should come work here. And I was like, no, I hate all those people. I've been coding since I was like 4 or 5 years old. We had computers in our house. I was like, I hate. And he's like, okay, but you said you needed money. I was like, oh, that's true. So I took a job at Microsoft thinking it would also be for 1 year. In the end, I was there for about 9. So I'm not good at keeping these 1-year promises, it seems. But I really, really love software. And I didn't know that I was going to love software. And specifically, I loved the business of software, which was a huge shock to me. Because truly, as an academic, I was like, anti-business, anti-capitalist. I was like a socialist linguist. Like never, ever in a million years would I have considered that my future calling would be like as a tech entrepreneur. Never, ever. But I loved making software. And I remember my second interview at Microsoft. Actually, the first interview, I interviewed for a localization job that they negged me for, which was good because I would have hated working in localization. But the recruiter was like, she so obviously should be in product. And so the recruiter saw the feedback from that loop and tracked me into the correct part of the company. And then I got hired. But in that product interview, there was a much more experienced person who asked me when I would know that a product was ready to ship. And I gave this really nerdy academic answer. And I was like, well, it's just never ready. You just fork it, get some feedback. But I had this model of like publication where you like publish, but it's like your life's work. You're never done. And he was like, no, you're ready to ship when people will pay you for it. And it was like an entire education in 90 seconds. They hired me anyway. And it took me about a year to really understand what he had meant by that. But that's how it got started. And then it turns out I love software. I love making software. I love the business of software. I love software. Like now that's it. I'm a software person.
Yeah. Yeah. And have been for a long time now. It's fascinating because, when you entered into my life, I viewed you as this like fully formed, exceptional product person. And it's so interesting to hear you reflecting on these experiences where, obviously we all have our beginnings before we shape into the people and the leaders we become. So I'm really curious how you kind of got shaped into and groomed into the product leader that you've become through these experiences while you were was it at these companies where that you kind of built this like expertise and background and perspective that you have now on product?
Yes and no. So I break my tech career into two parts. There's probably a third part, which is the part I'm in now. But the two long parts were the parts where I worked for other people, and then the part where I started my own company. In the parts where I worked for other people, which were mostly at Microsoft, I learned more about how you create and ship software than I did about product per se, even though I did have product titles. And I think that's because in big companies, even as a PM, you are so far away from customers.
Yeah.
Right? You sort of take for granted or take as a given what your customer facing people bring back to the business as feedback. And some were way above you. And I know I was reasonably senior by the time I left that world, but still, and I had some conversation with customers, but like not like at a startup. And so I felt like I learned more about making and shipping software. I learned a lot about quality. I learned a lot about managing software teams. I learned a lot of really important things. But I think my product skills, pure product skills, accelerated significantly after we started Textio. And the entire job before you have a product is you have to figure out what the product is you're building. So even the new products I built at Microsoft came in the context of a billion-person customer base. Right. So like even products that end up being clunkers start off on third base, in terms of the advantages they have. Startups don't have any of that. So it makes you get really honest really fast about whether you're building something that's actually useful to people. So I think a lot of it was just the first few years of Textio being the product person, the customer person, the salesperson, having to be in that triangle all the time.
Yeah. That makes sense. So you built a lot of the like component skills maybe that would allow you to lead the team effectively and make sure that software was getting shipped, but all the product and customer related aspects of it came once you went out on your own after the fact.
I think they at least accelerated a lot then.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. So somewhere along the way when I was researching for this, I found this question that you said was kind of the central thing at the beginning of Textio. And you said it was, what if you could know before you ever published something, who was going to respond? And I'm really curious about when this question started to form for you, or whatever version of the question it feels like is true now, and how that formed into you should start a company around it.
Okay. This is not a linear story. Barrett, I'm going to tell you the story as it really happened, not like as I usually tell
it.
You get the good story. Okay. So we didn't start Textio. Jensen and I, and for people who don't know, I co-founded Textio with my husband, which is unusual. Though we absolutely had masses of background in building word processing software, and in his case, multiple time billion person user experience products, he and our VP of design basically invented current user paradigms for email. Like, I mean, they've done all these really remarkable things. We didn't start that. We started a company called KidGrid. And KidGrid was an app for parents on the go. We had
No
little
way.
kids, and it was an app to help you find playgrounds and stuff. Like, it was totally different. And we really in fact, Textio today is a DBA, as it does business of KidGrid Inc. And we started KidGrid. And we had 3 engineers who agreed to join us, who were all people who had worked for me before at Microsoft. And I remember Jensen and I, as KidGrid's getting going. And in fact, by the way, if you look in the depths of the internet, you can find one article I wrote for VentureBeat as the CEO of KidGrid. And ironically, given that Textio ended up becoming an HR tech company that helps people hire and recruit, the thing I wrote about is how we wrote job descriptions at KidGrid to get the talent that we wanted. True story. You can go find this article. As we're starting to look around at this consumer business and realize consumer businesses are freaking hard, man. Consumer businesses are almost impossible to get off the ground. And we were talking to a few friends of friends, VCs, who were like, you're crazy. I'd back you guys. You want to do something different? Never backing this playground app. And this whole thing takes place in the span of a month. Okay. So it wasn't a long time. Jensen and I had a meeting with Steven Sinofsky, who had been both of our boss at Microsoft. Steven Sinofsky was the longtime president of everything, Office and Windows, still a good friend, but really an important mentor to both of us. I was starting to publish stuff about bias at work. I had some articles go hyper viral in places like Fortune and Washington Post and so on. And we started looking at this and realized we might be missing an opportunity to do something that we could uniquely contribute to, which is really the future of word processing. So we started kicking around these ideas. We had this notion that the history of word processing was defined by a few big eras. First, there were typewriters. My mom used that. You had to use whiteout if you made a mistake, no backspace, right? And then, PCs are invented, and all of a sudden word processors are a thing, and you can backspace. It's magic. And WordPerfect was an old piece of software that basically won that era until graphical user interface came along, right? It's another big sort of disruptive event. And, maybe Apple sort of helped invent that. Microsoft won it, and Microsoft Word ended up pretty much obliterating WordPerfect out of the market. Maybe a few law firms held on, but it pretty much won. And that lasted for 10 years until the internet comes along, which is this other big disruptive event. And Google acquires a company named Writely and turns it into Google Docs. I met the Writely co-founders last year. This year. It was the greatest moment of my life. I'm such a big fan of what they did. And then Google Docs comes along and ends up splitting the market with Microsoft. So we had this whole idea that you could actually do better than all of that stuff. You could actually make the words work, which nobody had really done besides grammar checking. You could actually make them perform. And then when we started talking to Steven about it, he's like, this is what you guys are going to win. And so we didn't start an HR tech company even. We started a word processing company. History did not play it out that way. It turns out we started an HR tech company, which is a whole other story. But we were starting a word processing company. And in fact, the first investment round we raised, we were 7 weeks old as a company, post the KidGrid 3 weeks or whatever. And we raised with the Kickstarter predictor. But I remember sitting in this apartment with our 3 engineers who had come and tried to use all this mapping technology. And we told them surprise, we're not KidGrid anymore. We're Textio now. And they were like, okay.
That's so funny.
That was Textio's start. But yep.
Oh, that's such a good story.
Yep. That's the reality. That's how it happened.
Yeah. So many companies, I feel get started in a completely unrelated way, and then you find your way into the thing that really ends up working. It's also fascinating, we can start to see some of the ways that your background in linguistics and your academia kind of tenure allowed you to then apply the same principles to what you were doing at Textio, to look at word processing completely differently and say, well, what if we can get predictive instead of corrective about the way that we're doing this whole thing? And that was a fundamental kind of paradigm shift, I think, for how people write things. in this case for HR related stuff, job listings, performance feedback, and everything that it's become. I know that when I found out about Textio, I wished I had known about it years earlier, because it was like, oh, I've been trying to figure all this out on my own, doing like little A/B tests on outreach emails and job listings and like what language gets included that encourages the right people to apply and all of this. And you all had been working on it for years at that point. It just felt like this obviously needed thing in the industry. But before we get to all of that, when did Jensen enter the picture? Because you all have formed this really beautiful life and business partnership and started this company together. So when did he enter the picture?
We met at Microsoft years before Textio, and I knew him because we were both working on Windows 8, much maligned Windows 8, speaking of products that don't always land. And then, yeah, I mean, we ended up, obviously, we're married. So somewhere between meeting and today, we got married. But we actually weren't married when we started Textio. We were together, which was very controversial for early investors, like super
I was going to
controversial.
ask, was that a major topic in fundraising meetings?
Yes, it was a major topic. In our first round, we had some really fun stories. Like we had somebody who I had a great first pitch meeting with, and then he realized we were married and like literally threw us out of his office. And we will never, ever send founders back to that, back to that firm again. But we learned really quick to tell people in the first 30 seconds of knowing us that we were married, because we didn't want to seem like we were trying to pull a fast one. Yeah, right. In the end, Emergence Capital, who led our Series A, and Gordon Ritter, who we love, still on our board, had a like super awkward dinner conversation with us about like governance. And I think maybe sex, but he didn't exactly say the word sex. Like it was a very awkward discussion. So yes, it was really awkward in the beginning for investors, but once the company got going and we were a year or two in, it didn't really matter anymore, because at that point, we work so well together. Like this is actually the hardest part of my current chapter. So when I stepped down as Textio's CEO at the start of the year, Jensen took on the CEO role, and man, it is good for the company that he did. He brought so much fresh energy to it. And I was pretty tired after 9 years. But the hardest part for me as I contemplate potentially starting another company is like, oh, I bet Jensen wouldn't be my co-founder for this one. And like, it feels like such a gift that we've gotten. You said we built this beautiful life, that we've gotten to do this together. And there's no one else I'd rather found with. Like, I mean, he's top of the chart for me. We work so well together. So that part's a little bit of a bummer, but it's been a great year for me. He has a much harder job than I do this year.
This year. I'm fascinated by what you think makes that work for you, because it's exceedingly rare. It's rare to start a company with your partner, although we see it fairly, somewhat commonly, I guess. If you look hard enough, you can find examples of it. But it's definitely rare where a couple can continue to have a good life together after they've done that it can often be a wedge that gets created by going into business together on top of life together. What do you think's made it work for y'all? If there's like someone listening that is in that position or is thinking about it, what advice would you have for them?
It's funny because when I announced early this year that I was expanding my coaching practice, the first type of person who reached out to me are married founders.
Oh, interesting.
I don't specifically work with married founders, but I've had so many people who co-founded with a partner or a spouse reach out. I don't know. It wouldn't work for everybody, but we both love work. Like we love making stuff. We love work. And we have overlap in the right things. I'd say like around standards and values, but significant complementarity in our actual skills. So it's just when you know for sure you share values and a quality bar on what counts as good enough. And we have strongly shared cultural values. Like that's a place where I would say most of the time at Textio, you could have had either of us in the room if it was a hard cultural conversation, and we would have said exactly the same thing. And we have full trust on that. It just makes it really easy to divide the space in a way that creates something good, because the skills we have are different. In fact, when we started the company, we had a significant discussion over who should be CEO and who should be CTO, because on paper, it actually would have made more sense to do it the other way based on our backgrounds. He was a much more prestigious executive than I was at the time we started the company. He had been the spokesperson for Microsoft on all UI efforts for many years, right? For Windows, for Microsoft Office, for Outlook, for everything. And I'm the one who has the relevant PhD, right? He has a music degree. So like it doesn't really make a lot of sense, except if you know us. It was the only thing that made sense, right? Like Jensen is magical on stage and he's an incredibly adept manager, but most of the time he'd rather be coding. Like he far prefers actually making things. And I'm like all hustle. Like I am so happy to be out telling people about the product and getting feedback. So we chose the roles we chose because I mean, I ended up doing all the sales and customer because I was the only person on the early exclusively technical team who was like willing to do it. But yeah, it works because we share the right things and we're different in the right ways. And any business we started, that would end up being applicable. Like we've talked about expanding the coaching practice after in a post-Textio life, because he's also, by the way, a coach and an excellent one. So I don't know. I bet it's not the last business we'll do together.
That's so cool. I love hearing about that side of things. But obviously there was a whole company to run and grow, that like your relationship was a piece of it and a core piece of it, but there was an entire thing to get done, which has all of the common problems of building a company, finding product market fit, building a team, recruiting people, finding new customer bases, product strategy. So I'm curious, as you look back, there's so much that I would love to ask about here in the 9-year tenure of when you were CEO, but when did you all know that you had found product market fit?
Okay. I think we knew it kind of, and then we really knew it. So when we first brought Textio to market, we did an invite-only beta. And it was a really simple editor where you could go and pop in a job post and get some feedback on the job post you were writing. And it was invite only because you're creating a little bit of cachet. And also we weren't ready to expand our usage to the entire internet. And so, by the way the invite only meant was like, I picked you. If you put in a request, I manually went and looked you up on LinkedIn. I was like, does this person seem like someone we would eventually sell to or a tech influencer? Cool. Also, PS, like we gave everyone access in the first couple of weeks because we didn't get so many requests
Right,
that it was
that's
like,
how that always goes.
Right. But very quickly, we had way too many to do that with because Liz Gaines, who was the reporter who broke the Ellen Pao trial, wrote about us and told everybody, by the way, to this day, it bites Textio. She wrote an article that said that we were planning on charging $59 per person per month, which is super cheap. And to this day, we have people calling Textio saying like, here's my $59. It's like, that's not how it's priced. But anyway, the whole like inbound just exploded. And so we came out of invite only free trial into like or a beta into like a 2-week free trial, and you could like self-serve yourself an account with your credit card on our website. So at that point we saw, I'll call it pitch market fit. Like we knew that we had a value prop that people wanted, and we could see that people were coming into the website and they were starting to purchase. Like I remember one night we sort of flipped the bit. Our first employee, who was our longtime engineering leader, and Jensen recently brought back to Textio, Bobby Kolba, who was my right-hand person at Microsoft years ago. He like did the final hookup to make credit card billing possible. And then like 10 minutes later, we had a purchase from somebody in the UK. And he was like, is this a bug? Like, what just happened? Like, somebody just gave us $1,000. What's going on? At that point, we knew we had something because people were paying for it. But I don't think we really had product market fit because we wanted to be selling to entire enterprises, not to individuals. And so what happened was that ability for people to buy on the website individual accounts cannibalized our enterprise sales. So you might be like, hey, I'm going to buy an account and I'm going to share it around my company. I'm going to pay $59 a month for it. And we're like, oh, this is not good. You're writing like 10,000 job posts a year. Something is really wrong. So about 2 quarters into that, we changed our pricing model. And instead of doing single serve, self-serve, individual accounts. We started doing site licenses based on the number of job posts you had open. And you can see what happens to our revenue. We go from growing like this to growing like this in 6 weeks.
Wow.
It was shocking. So at that point, we knew we had product market fit because, going back to that lesson from Microsoft, like a product is a thing people pay for. And so you don't really have product market fit until you have something people will pay you for in a sustainable way, like that where your unit economics make sense. So at that point, it made sense for us and we knew we had something. And then you don't really, really know until people renew.
Yeah, right. And way after the fact, even in hindsight, because sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to even know what's going on. Okay, so at this point in the interview, I will reveal that you were on the board, still are on the board of ConvertKit, now Kit, which I was the COO of for a number of years, which was how we got to know each other.
You recruited me.
That's right, I did. And I have a question about that a little bit later, but to go to the whole just macro of this conversation, I did. I sent you a recruiting email, which in hindsight now I realize is just, if I had gotten any in my head about that whole thing, I never would have done it. And I feel confident. So much of the advice you would give us was around looking at macro things like that, pricing strategy, how we were packaging the product, making sure that the value proposition was matching what people valued in what they were getting from it. And so it's interesting now to hear this story that this was a key learning on that you basically had the same product and you changed the way you were packaging and pricing it so that it reflected the value people were getting from it. And that was a major trajectory change in the organization. It's so interesting to me.
Yes. See, I often feel with Kit, like I learn a couple years ahead and I'm watching Kit go through a lot of the same learning. And I felt that way since we started working together 4.5 years ago.
Yeah,
right?
Which is perfect. It's like the ideal board member. Okay, so you had this moment when things start to come together, and I'm always interested in, as an entrepreneur, I've been an entrepreneur, I am one now, I've been an executive. I notice for myself that there's just this constant, if we just make it to this point, if we just make it to that point, if we just make it to that point, then everything will be good. And I'm smart enough and just wise enough now to know that that's a story that doesn't ever actually come true, that there's always another thing. Also, Textio has staying power. I have a lot of confidence that Textio is a long-term company built for the long haul. Reflecting back now, was there a point when that became true where you felt like, okay, we're going to make it, we are going to have staying power here, not just have early success?
So I'm going to say something controversial that is not about Textio, but no company has indefinite staying power. That just doesn't exist. So there's a company here in Seattle that was a multi-billion-dollar company named Convoy in the shipping and logistics space, went out of business. This year, it went out of business. And when I tell you they were the biggest company in the city that wasn't Microsoft or Amazon or Expedia, no one is really permanent unless you make the choices that keep you successful every single day. So that's not a comment on Textio, but I just don't believe in a binary here of you make it, you don't. I think Jason Lemkin at some point wrote something that I read that was once you get to 10 million of ARR, you're unkillable. I get where he's going with that, but you're not. Companies fall out of product market fit all the time when a better competitor comes along or a new disruptive technology comes along. And so going back to your question about Textio, certainly we stopped feeling like the next minute you might go out of business. But even in 2020, so March of 2020, you lived in the world, so you remember what that was like. It's around the time we met, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
February of 2020, Textio had 8 weeks of cash in the bank. We were pretty successful at that point. We had certainly more than 10 million of ARR, right? We were unkillable according to several VCs. But I had to get a round done as the pandemic was coming. In fact, we announced that round the same day we did our first ever company layoff, which was brutally difficult for our employees. The cognitive dissonance of that was terrible for everybody. You can't celebrate. People are losing their jobs. The country, the world's in some kind of turmoil. We got a round done. Well, it turns out that was the round that helped the company hit the next, we needed that round or the company would have folded. And so I think that experience taught me like not to believe in you're
Making it.
unkillable. Like you might be built for the long haul, but there is no long haul unless you continue to make the decisions you need to make every single day. And like I really watched what happened at Convoy this year. It was like even though I believe that, it was a huge eye opener. I cannot tell you how much they seemed unkillable. Like I
Yeah.
cannot possibly. And I know that founding team, like great team, like super great people in the organization, very accomplished executives. So I don't think there were many points where I'm like, okay, we got through that one.
And yeah, it's just kind of the reality, I think, where, you believe that you will hit this point where, okay, we're okay now. And there's another thing. There's always another thing.
All you can do, and I really mean this, like, of course, everybody's trying to make their companies successful. And that means you're having a certain impact in the world. Maybe it's financial. Like there's a lot of aspects to success. But truly, the only thing you can take to the bank from any entrepreneurial journey, the only thing is the experience you get. That's literally all you got. And that's honestly true for anybody professionally. Like it's all you got is the experience you're getting and how you're going to use that for your future, your development. Was it fun? And like no job is 100% fun. But like if it's not feeling at least 80 to 85% fun, you're not going to reach some mythological milestone where all of a sudden it's good and it's fun. You should do a different thing.
Yeah.
And so like I feel really grateful. If Textio went out of business today, I wouldn't regret the way I spent the last decade. Like not for a second.
Yeah.
I don't know if Jensen would agree. It'd be actually an interesting conversation, but like I wouldn't regret it because I've gotten to do so much really cool stuff and like help people get jobs who wouldn't have had them and changed the way people think about writing and the way people think about equity in organizations. And like, that's pretty worthwhile for a short life, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Well, some dinner table fodder there, maybe for you and Jensen and the girls. But you mentioned that and I've heard you say a thing like you just said, which is it's something like, do the thing you want to do until you no longer want to do it anymore and then move on. Or something like that is a quote that I've heard you say multiple times. And that's very reminiscent of that. And as I understand it, about the time that you were laying folks off, which many, many companies did as a kind of preemptive measure heading into the pandemic, and then raising the round, you started to question whether you wanted to be in that role anymore. That was kind of, it wasn't just hard on the team, it was hard on you. And it seemed like that was kind of the first time, or as I think you wrote about it, the first time you said out loud, I think we might need to start looking for a new CEO. And I wonder what that moment was like for you saying that to the board out loud.
Yeah, I said that in June of 2020. We had a board call. So no one was in person, right? Everything was Zoom. My office in our house at the time, we had a really tiny house for the five of us during the pandemic in the city. And my quote unquote office was under my daughter's loft bed. There's actually a picture of me in March of 2020 in the Wall Street Journal surrounded by her stuffed animals that Jensen took because they were looking at like how executives are working from home. And mine obviously cuts above that fray because like here's a CEO with like baskets of stuffed animals around her, right? So I remember sitting in my daughter's room underneath her loft bed, and I just cried and cried and cried on a board call, which I certainly had never done. And I was like, yeah, I think I'm done. Like I didn't just say I think we need a new CEO. I was like, I'm quitting. Like this is it. And they were pretty understanding. I remember, again, the same way it was hard for my employees, it was hard for me. They were also people living in the world at the time, right? Like no one was having an easy time, but they were pretty understanding. Ultimately, they persuaded me not to quit because I wasn't, obviously it's my company. So there's no like mic drop, you're out, right? So it was always going to be, we'll find someone for the rest, I'll stay at the end of the year. Obviously, I didn't quit in the end. In late 2020, we got really close to selling the company, which we decided not to do. And then I went on a vacation with my family. We drove out to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State near the coast. And I remember I was like, okay, well, like, what would I tell a new CEO to do if they were coming in right now? And to my surprise, it was really clear because I would have said I didn't know what to do. And then I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess like I have to go do those things. And so I obviously stayed for another 4 years, 3.5, 4 years. But it was a really hard moment. And I think the difference, I was very emotionally overwhelmed mentally overwhelmed. I had just watched my daughter miss her elementary school graduation and have a drive-through graduation, which was like the first time I had cried during the pandemic about the pandemic, watching Jensen take her picture in front of her school one at a time with all the cars behind us. It was really, really hard. When I ended up actually stepping down, it was a totally different conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like I felt like, oh, okay, new product's doing well. There's cash in the bank. The exec team is rebuilt. We have a good CEO to put in place. And so when I gave notice, actually, I didn't have an emotional moment in a board meeting. I did the thing that actually you would do as a CEO, which is I called all of the investors one-on-one. I told them what I was doing. And every single one of them, every single one without exception was like, thank you. I'm so happy for you. And then one of them asked if I wanted to start a new company with her like right away. And I was like, no. Not this minute, but like on the same call, she's like, I got something for us to do. I'm like, okay, well, maybe we talk in a few months. But like, you know, they were actually, it was a totally different experience.
Yeah. It's so interesting how a frame shift like that, going from what do I think we need to do to what would I tell a new CEO that they need to do? Just a little mind trick like that can open up this new ground. And then for you to have kind of your roadmap laid out in front of you that you then went and executed, which from a place of, you know, breaking down crying in a board meeting, which is, I think that crying at work happens and people are going to do it. And like the job is to support them in it. But you are one of the strongest people I know that I've worked with. And so it's kind of jarring to hear that you had gotten to that point in the middle of a board meeting. From that to then being able to go and check all of those things off the list that you just talked about is really impressive. But it came at a cost, because it went from stress in a moment of like kind of mini crisis that you were in to full on burnout. And
yeah, I think so.
You know, you wrote this article about burnout. Let me see if I can find the quote that I pulled from it real quick. You describe burnout as when you no longer feel the ability or desire to manage the difficulty that comes from the stress you've been going through. And so it sounds to me like that's kind of the point that you got to, was like, okay, I can't manage this anymore. I actually want to move on from this. But also you did it in the like very professional, structured, methodical way that I would kind of expect of you, given what I know of you. And I'm sure that other people, like you said, appreciated. But what cost did you have to pay for that, I guess is my question. What were you going through all of that?
Shortly before I stepped down, Jensen and I had a friend who had worked for Textio for a couple of years. He had left Textio in 2021 or 2022 for his dream job. He was really excited. It was like the right job, the right company. We were really sorry to see him go, but like really excited for him. And he was diagnosed with ALS last year. He's probably about 40. He has 2 little kids. He was the major breadwinner. And we watched him go from vibrant, professionally fully engaged, excited about what he was doing, to unable to work. Like he's not able to work. And the thing about ALS, it's a terrible disease. You don't know if you have 6 months left or 6 years or 20. He still has 2 little kids, right? And so I think for me, spending a little bit of time with him and learning about what his family was experiencing, I think I just got to a point of like, oh, life is actually short. You don't actually know when it's going to end. The other thing that happened between 2021 and 2022 is Jensen had 4 surgeries. So he emerged healthy, thank God, like he emerged good. But it meant during that period of time, he really was kind of not at home effective as a parent. Like and he couldn't work. So like it was just me. And so I just got to the point in the middle of 2023 when I was like, okay, I am not having fun. You know, you do that again, that is it 85% fun. I was having like 25% fun. And that balance just wasn't okay. And especially as I watched this friend go through this, I'm just like, oh, I have another like act in me and I better figure out what it is, because like no one else is coming to figure it out for me. And it was really, really a hard decision until it wasn't. The best thing I can say. It was a really hard decision until it wasn't.
And
It
when did
was
the wasn't hit?
around the time our friend was diagnosed. Yeah, my therapist could tell you, I talked about this for like 3 years, right?
Yeah.
And then it stopped being hard. It stopped being a question of like, can I do this job? Because I like was doing the job, and more like, do I want to do this job right now? And
Yeah.
by the way, I will be a CEO again. I love CEOing. It did not take me very long for my creative energy to rebound, actually much faster than I thought, which means
Yeah.
it was really the right decision for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I was surprised by it because you kind of got back to work pretty quick and have just been cranking through great data driven insights and teaching for people with Nerd Processor. And then through your coaching, I'm sure you're delivering the same kind of thing. Before we move on from the kind of the departure to in the second half of the conversation, I want to talk a lot more about some of the work you've been doing, some of the insights that you've shared. I was reading back through your post about transitioning out of Textio, which I love following all of your stuff, but I was fascinated by this because you had been one of the people that I went to for advice when I was exiting my role as COO
That's true.
at ConvertKit. And so I had gone through my own version of this, different circumstances and all of that. But I think a similar kind of like identity shift and letting go of things and kind of like entering into an unknown period afterwards. So you said in that post, I spent a lot of time at the end of the year reflecting whether I'm the right CEO to take Textio into this next wave. Textio is my company, and its impact and success are deeply personal for me. I don't just want Textio to not fail. I want us to succeed in huge, outsized ways. And if I'm being honest, 9 years in, I need some time to recharge. Textio's success is much too important to me to show up with only part of the energy required to effectively lead. And so it kind of captures a lot of what you were just sharing. But I think you're the second person I've had on the show now who has had the courage to do this. I think many people hang on much longer than is good for them or the company.
Mm-hmm.
And you maybe hung on longer than was totally good for you, but you hung on the right amount for what was good for the company for sure.
I think that's true.
I guess maybe it comes back to that black and white moment of like seeing your friend go through that, but it just takes so much humility to say, I'm not the right person. And I'm curious, like, what fueled that for you? What allowed you to step out and say, this is going to be okay. And it's actually going to be better if I make this move?
So first of all, I spent a lot of time way before this decision and way before the pandemic doing the work that most founders struggle with, which is decoupling my sense of self-esteem from Textio's performance. It's very, very hard when you have founded something. I mean, maybe people who are parents can understand this, right? Like even if you've never founded a company, if you have a kid, especially as your kid gets older, my kids are all teenagers now, the work of parenting is letting them do their thing, even if it's not your thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like the choices they're going to make, the good ones, the bad ones, the things they're going to get into, their success or failure is not like a vicarious vehicle for you. And it's actually mostly not an indictment or a celebration of what kind of parent you are. Like the thing that is a celebration of what kind of parent you are is their ability to make choices that are different than the ones that you would make. And so when you're founded a company, it's really easy to and every founder I know goes through this, no exceptions. You feel good about yourself when the numbers are up and to the right, and you feel like a failure when you're not. And in many ways, that's very adaptive as a founder, right? Like it's really important that you're not using bullshit metrics to decide how good a job you're doing. The things that actually matter are your revenue, your retention, and your employee satisfaction. Like literally, that's all there is, right? And so when you can get that analytical about it, it's easy to then make the problematic equation of if those are good, then I'm good. And if those are bad, then I'm bad. When in reality, lots of things go into that. And how you show up is the only part of it you can really control. So I had already done like lots and lots of work in therapy with my own coach to try to disentangle my self-esteem from Textio. And once I got there, I realized I could say out loud and mean it what I said to you a few minutes ago, which is that if Textio went out of business tomorrow, I would regret nothing.
Yeah.
Like, sure, I made some good decisions, bad decisions along the way, but like, I don't feel less capable or more capable as a professional because of the outcome of this company. And that was very different for me. And so once I do that, and it's not about my ego anymore, then it just becomes rational calculation of like, okay, well, literally, I have a job. I get paid to do a job, right? I'm the CEO of this company. My job as the CEO of this company is to plan for this company's longevity. That's my job. And so what's the best way to help the company be successful? And, when Jensen came on, Jensen's a very different leader than me. I am so much more in the details of everything. Like, I think the team probably experiences us pretty differently because I can go deep in any part of the business immediately and understand what's going on. Jensen can too, but he doesn't. He is so much better at holding the execs accountable, like hiring the great people. And then, like, if they don't do a good job, he will let them go. But he's good at the holding them accountable. Whereas I often have the swoop problem, right? Like, if they work a little wobbly, I would swoop, which disempowers them and sets them up for failure. They don't know what they're accountable for.
Right.
And so when I sort of looked, it was like, okay, well, what does the company need? I really love working in those early stage ways. I wasn't enjoying working in like a late stage way. Could I enjoy it? Maybe, but I wasn't. Whereas all that experience he had as a larger company executive, turns out like this is the moment for it, So but it started with like decoupling my ego from Textio's performance. So and it just allowed me to view Textio's performance a lot more rationally.
That's a really great insight for anyone running a company. Even as an exec, just being able to, really in any career path, I guess, is being able to separate your sense of self-worth from the outcomes that are happening in your role or in your company.
Yep.
It's so hard. Much of the way we get trained is to associate those things. So I have two questions I want to wrap up with in this first half of the conversation. And the first one is on how you maintain like a standard of excellence and performance in the face of that. So I don't believe this to be true, but I think there is a common misconception that if you detach your sense of kind of identity and self-worth from the outcomes you're producing, that then you won't be able to produce good outcomes anymore. So how do you think about balancing those things, that like you can maintain distance while also driving progress and performance and excellence, is my first question.
Well, emotional distance and intellectual distance are not the same thing. I mean, I'll say like the really unpopular thing, like founders who outwork others are more successful. That's a fact. Like we can like dress it up all that we want, but like the truth is you do have to be pretty obsessed with your business to get something off the ground, whether you're a solopreneur or building a business that's, big scale, lots of employees. And so I think that's not the same as having your self-worth attached to the performance. So intellectual, emotional are different. But this goes back to the 85% fun thing again. Like if you are not enjoying 80 to 85% of the way you are spending your working hours and you are lucky enough to have a choice, you should make a different choice.
Yeah.
Not everyone can make a different choice, but if you can, and frankly, people who are starting tech companies can mostly make a different choice, you have to make a different choice or you're going to end up certainly unhappy, but actually your business is not going to stay successful long term. Right?
That's just really good.
It's just not, because it's contagious. It's contagious.
Yes.
And, it's fun. We just had a Textio board meeting a month ago, and Jensen and the team presented because I'm still on the board, presented the plan for 2025. And after the meeting, I was talking to him and we don't talk about Textio as much as you might think that we would now. And we do, but not as much as you would think. So I'm not in the day-to-day in the same way. And he finished that meeting and I was like, whoa, you did like a really good job this year. Like, I know I'm like your wife and like, but like I would have kept Textio humming along in basically the same state forever. And like the company will either end up massively successful or it won't. But like he has so much more appetite to take the risks, and the way he's managing the team, I'm like, you have just absolutely validated the decision we made, like 100%. And it was like actually like this huge light bulb moment for me. I mean, I knew it, but like I really knew it when I saw the decisions and the plan. So I think the company is just going to do better than it would have,
Yeah.
And it's already happening. So
there is a difference though between this like theoretical belief in a person and a team and then seeing it in action. There's just a difference. There's a gap between it. And so getting to see it come true has got to be validating, number one, but also reassuring that like, okay, it's going to be good. I'm going to be good. They're going to be good.
Yes. And I think that is parallel with me having been so much happier this year than I
Yes.
had been in years. So like those two things side by side. Some people have asked me at various points, like, is there any point you like regretted the decision? I can honestly tell you I've had 0 minutes of regret. Since making the decision, not even one time have I been like, oh man, I wonder if. 0 minutes of regret, which makes it so clear that it was the right decision. But the company is in better leadership than it was with burned out me at the
Yeah.
helm. And I am so much happier and more creative and enjoying my work. And I haven't really worked less this year. I've actually worked a lot this year. I've many, many gigs, but it's so much more fun than it was. I'm back to that 85% fun, maybe even 95% fun this year. So, I mean, it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's a good, powerful lesson for, I think, especially early stage founders who enjoy that 0 to 1 phase, the phase of early building, and get to a point where they hit that mark and it's like, no, this is 75% not fun. That it's an okay decision. It can work out okay as well. But it does take some courage and humility to say, I'm going to move on and it's going to be better. Okay, so my last question here in this part, and then I want in the second half, well, I'll tell people about the second half in just a minute. But so with the year of distance and now hindsight on your term as CEO, you had 9 years. How would you evaluate your performance as a CEO?
Oh, I mean, gosh, I don't even know how to answer this question. Despite everything I just said about hyper rationality, this is not a topic I can be rational on because I see every failure. Like I see more of my failures than anybody else sees, including Jensen, including the board, including every employee. Like I'm sure they could tell you lots of my failures, but like I promise they're not going to say something I haven't thought about, and I probably have thought about more. That said, I mean, I guess the company ended up successful over a pretty long period of time and having lots and lots of impact. So I guess to the state that I had to get it into, I give myself an A minus. Like I can't quite give myself an A because I see a lot of mistakes along the way. If I had hired better executives earlier, could that have been an A? Probably. If I had, felt less pressure early on to like present a good face and actually just looked at the reality of the data, would that have been more like an A? Probably. Like one of the reasons, you talked about Kit, like one of the reasons I truly love working with Nathan at Kit is because of all the CEOs I work with, and I work with a lot this year, more than anybody else I have ever worked with, he actually wants to know the truth about his business such that he convenes a board he does not have to convene as a bootstrapped solo founder twice a year to get us to rip apart his plan. And then he does stuff with the feedback, right? He and his team do things with that. And I actually feel like working with him has given me a lot of confidence about how I want to be the next time. Because I don't think in my first few years as CEO, I had that. I felt so much pressure to like put the good story together. And I think the thing that I like got through this sort of journey is like, I just don't care that much about the good story anymore. I want to know the true story. Because if it's not a good story, then like, I just don't want to do it. Why spend your time on that? Do something that could be. And so like, I actually really appreciate that about him. I think it's been a real education working with him that way. He just wants to know the truth about the business. Everyone should be that way. I wasn't always that way. I felt, again, that it's the separation of the ego from the company performance that enables you to sort of get there. So I don't know, A minus.
That's good. I like that. If you haven't heard of Nathan Barry and you're listening, we did an episode. It was kind of like a 2-hour retrospective on our 5 years working together. That was really fun.
It was a great episode.
Thank you. If you scroll back through the feed, you can listen to that one. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk about Nerd Processor, a lot of the research and writing that you've been doing, the teaching, a little bit about how you spend your time when you're not getting paid. And then we'll wrap up from there.
Sounds good.
All right, we're back. I am going to ask a totally selfish question, but I think it will be informative to the audience as well, because I really strongly believe in having either like an informal or a formal board of advisors for your career, for your company, kind of a group of people you go to for advice, for wisdom on how to make good decisions about where you're going. And this was part of what led us to create a more formal structure for a board at ConvertKit was both Nathan and my desire at the time for wise advice, because we are both, and were certainly at the time, both very young in terms of our roles and what we were trying to accomplish. we knew we didn't have all the answers. So as part of that, I reached out to a group of people who I thought would make great board members. And you mentioned this earlier, that I reached out cold to you and sent this email and said, hey, would you like to join our board? And so I'm curious, what ultimately made you say yes to that when you get approached so often to do things that could occupy your time?
Yeah, I remember that email. And it came, as I said, right as all the shit was hitting the fan in the world and my company and everything. There were a couple of things that were uniquely appealing about ConvertKit at the time. One, the fact that it was bootstrapped and very successfully so. So I know the venture world really well. I'm founder in residence right now at a venture fund. I'm an LP in that venture fund. My Textio was venture backed, right? I coach lots of founders who are venture backed. Although I will say the bootstrap founders that I work with, and there are several now, are like, man, they are some of the strongest people. Like, they're so good because they have to look at the truth about their business, right? There's that's what you got to do. So the fact that it was bootstrapped made me feel like I could learn a new way of operating that might be interesting that I didn't have as much exposure to, although obviously my dad bootstrapped his company, right? And the other thing that was interesting to me was the space itself. Like, it was not a space I had thought about, but I obviously make a lot of content. I had built a software company that is about content performance to a really high degree. So it felt like there was enough adjacency to be like I could have some things to add, and it was interesting. And I always sort of thought long term, I was curious about, I'd say, like the creator go to market, right? And now this year, I've spent a lot of time learning about the creator go to market as a practitioner, which I'm really grateful I've had these years on that board of exposure.
Mm-hmm.
But like, no one teaches you how to do the creator go to market. Like, I've been able to apply some things that I know from B2B, but a lot of the principles are similar, but the tactics are different.
Yeah.
And so I thought it had enough that was interesting to me. And then, of course, I got to know you guys and I liked you and thought you would be fun to work with. But the things that drew me initially were like the type of organization on the space.
If we kind of combine like our experience finding each other and then all the research you've done in terms of what works for outreach, if someone was recruiting someone to be a mentor, an advisor, a board member, what advice would you have for them to be effective at that, at going out, finding the right people, and then doing the outreach?
I mean, you're pretty unusual in having cold outreach work. So I will say the obvious thing, which is warm is better than cold. So in general, try to find a trusted shared colleague who might vouch for you. But like, if you don't have that, or even if you do, I mean, a lot of the people you probably want time from are busy people, right? They've accomplished things and that means they're busy, and that's why you want their time. And so when people reach out to me wanting time, I have pretty clear ways I engage different kinds of people. So like, oh, you're someone who took my viral data stories course. I'm going to put you in a different kind of time management bucket than if you want me to consider a board, or you want me to be potentially your coach, or you just want to like get feedback on a company idea that you have, right? So all of those, like, if I'm not diligent with how I manage that, I don't have a livable calendar. So most people you're reaching out to are in the same bucket. So the best thing you can do is figure out what would be interesting about it for them. Why should they say, you're not probably paying them right away. Why should they say yes? Why should they agree? And what's interesting about the opportunity that you're offering that other people might not be able to provide. And to the extent you can do that, then you sort of, align incentives. If you can actually not just reach out cold, you're such a thorough researcher, like you do your homework on the people, is why you have this show. But like, starting with some knowledge of the person and the kind of thing they might find interesting based on what they're saying on their social, or what you've seen them accomplish, or what you imagine the next step might be, or who else you see them associate with. All of these things increase your chances.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all really good. I'll never forget, I think your response back to me, which I had been trying to kind of like get really good at this because we had built a kind of outbound recruiting system for execs and high-level hires we were making. And so I was trying to figure out the equivalent version for the board. Your reply back was so indicative of what I came to value so much about your advice and our relationship. was something like, why did you reach out to me specifically? And it was this kind of like gently challenging test for, are you for real in a way? Like, do you actually have a reason you wanted me? Or is this one of 500 emails you just sent? Was kind of what I took away from it. And I actually did have a reason. I had like a legitimate reason why I reached out to you. And I thought number one, it kept me on my toes. And I was happy that I had actually put the work in up front. But also, I think it was indicative of the very thing we were looking for, which is someone to kind of like call us higher, to set the standard, to help us. When you're the standard setter internally, or one of them, you also need people who are going to hold you accountable to continue doing that and be the equivalent for you. And I felt like you were that for us. So for what that's worth, thank you.
Thank you
for being that. So you mentioned earlier, to take a little bit of a right turn here, that after you left Textio, to pick up where we left off that first half, you thought it might take a while to get your creativity back, to get kind of the like working energy back. And it really didn't take that long, all things considered. Certainly less time than it took me. When did the idea for Nerd Processor take shape? And when did you know that was kind of the outlet that you wanted for yourself?
Well, I think actually it may seem like I knew when I launched Nerd Processor, but Nerd Processor has gotten refined over this year. I knew two things only. I knew that writing was going to be an important component of any way I spent time this year. I have always been a writer. I've always, actually that led me to Textio in a very real way. Like a lot of it was the outside writing that ended up creating the space for the company, creating customer relationships. I love telling stories with data, like love it, love it, love it. And I'm really good at it. And it's something very few people are good at the way I'm good at it. I have a clear brand around it. When I started Nerd Processor, I was like, I'm going to tell stories with data. Gosh, can I do that every single week? Like that's a lot of work, but it's not peer reviewed research. So that allows you to, no one thinks it's peer reviewed research. There are like 800 word articles every week that give you some greatest hits and interesting places to dive in. So I knew writing was going to be a part of it. And I had already been working with some other companies, ConvertKit being one of them. I'm on a couple of other boards as well. And I advise a couple other companies. And I really enjoy that. If you get to work with great execs, it's really fun to enter into someone else's problem space and help people achieve their vision. And as soon as I announced I was leaving Textio, I had outreach from a lot of AI companies specifically, which makes sense, looking for various things, mostly advisories. And so I was like, oh, there's something interesting here. I coach for fun. I coach kids for fun. And I've always been a coach and a teacher. Mm-hmm. And so I started taking on a few coaching clients. And I still wasn't really sure what the mix was going to be of writing and coaching. I started off the year thinking like, I'm going to learn a creator go-to-market. Like that's the thing I wanted to learn in 2024. So started to think about how I would use social. Always Nerd Processor was going to be my free newsletter that set the stage for me to do other things. And ultimately, I built a couple courses this year that I wanted to experiment with how that worked and workshops that layer on top of them. And so all of that is like the creating it is fun, but figuring out how it all fits together into some kind of business is really fun. And so that's been interesting, which is why the course about viral data stories is so meta. It's like, because I'm using them to get people interested in the course. But then as the year went on, when I started writing, I did a combo of like data stories about work, which I've always done. But I started bringing in some of the other kinds of things I maybe would have just kept on LinkedIn before, of some of my lessons learned as a leader. And so I've done a bunch of work through the year to sort of calibrate. And then once I found the name, Nerd Processor, once I sort of landed on that, I was like, I have to do something worthy of this name. This is a really good name.
It is a really good name, especially given your background. Just
it's very me.
It's perfect. If anyone doesn't get it, Nerd Processor is like word processor, but data driven. So one of the things that I love about your work and that I think we have in common is that we really, from different angles, maybe love the research phase. I genuinely love the research phase of doing this show, for example, or even doing outreach. I don't know what it is. I just get in the zone when it comes to doing this kind of work. And you do too. Like the amount of background effort that goes into one 800-word article is not just putting the words on the page.
Right.
It's coding 1,100 hours of meetings, for example, to find the trends in them. And that might not be obvious on the surface, but when I hear you talk about it, that's everything I'm thinking is like, wow, a lot of work went into this. How do you select for your corpus and what you want to write about from those things?
So first of all, I don't do all the coding manually. I've written tools to help me with a bunch of the coding. And maybe I could even turn some of those tools into a software company at some point. Some of them are Textios, right, that I've created. But yes, it's still a lot of work, but the work isn't always doing the manual coding. Sometimes it's writing the tools that will do some of the coding. There's a real art to picking a data story hypothesis. You don't need to be a data scientist to do it. I'll give an example. You need to think about psychology a little bit and specifically about confirmation bias. So when I wrote the first really big piece, I mean, I've written a bunch of stuff in media, but the thing that went like super viral, the very first bias in performance reviews piece in Fortune in 2014, right before we started Textio, I think we had started KidGrid. We hadn't started Textio when that piece dropped.
Was this the abrasive aggressive one?
Yes, it's fundamentally about how high performing men and women are described differently in their performance reviews. And I had put out a call on social media to get people to send me their performance reviews, which PS is a lot easier when you're not the CEO of a company. And like hundreds of random people did. And I banked on the fact that they would all be high performers because who else is going to send their review over the internet? And I wanted to see if women and men were described differently, and they are. It was like the first piece that then like launched an avalanche of academic research that has since replicated and studied in much more depth than I did, right? But the reason I knew that story was going to be big is because it would have been big no matter what the data said. So if I had found, as I did, that women were significantly more likely to be described as abrasive and bossy, you meet the millions of women who were like, yeah, that happened to me. And I thought I was crazy, but I was being gaslit. Like there's a real thing here, right? So it plays into the confirmation bias of the real lived experience that people have had. If I had found the opposite, I mean, that would have been a scarier story to tell, but it still would have been a viral story.
Yeah.
Because it would have said to a bunch of people, you know, something that you believed was true. I want you to actually see the data. Let's see what's actually going on here. Right. And so when you set up a data story like this, you want to ask the question that no matter how the data shows up, it's going to give you an interesting story. So the meeting data that I've been looking at this year, I knew I wanted to look at variation in in-person and remote work settings because everyone's talking about it. No one has data about it at all, by the way. It's usually just like vibes and philosophy, right, that people have. And so I knew that if I found that one of them worked better than the other, either way, that was going to be a great story. And I knew that if I found they worked exactly the same, that was also going to be a great story. And so you set up the inquiry so that no matter how it goes, you have a story to tell. You don't always know what the story is going to be. That's where you have the data has to tell you what's there. But you can set up your inquiry so that you really increase your chances of getting something interesting to say.
That's really good. Yeah, the remote versus in-person thing is such a hot topic and one that elicits incredibly emotional responses from people. Often, like you said, based on vibes and opinions, which reminds me of another analysis you did of LinkedIn posts about feedback. And I think you found something like 85% of those are basically just vibes.
Vibes and opinions.
Yeah. And almost none had any specific tactical advice, and very few had personal stories attached that exemplified the thing that people were trying to get across. Is this just kind of like how we communicate generally online? And if we want to do it differently, so like if we want to be engines, people listening want to be engines for content that actually teaches well and shares something insightful, how do we do it differently?
Yeah. This is how we are online and offline. So if you walk through an outdoor cafe and you listen to the conversations that people are having, you just eavesdrop here and there. Most of what we do when we relate as people is we share totally uninformed opinions about things, right? That's like how we relate. You can be at your Thanksgiving table and by the way, if you have any expertise in what people are talking about, it's absolutely triggering and infuriating. Like my favorite part of being a linguist at my grandmother's Thanksgiving table was hearing how she thought her grandchild, who was growing up bilingual, needed to wait until he learned English first before learning his second language, which of course is like batshit untrue. But she
Right.
was my grandma. So like, did not matter that I had a PhD in linguistics. Did not matter. How she thinks it is how it is. And by the way,
Right.
people have all kinds of views about language. And so if you're a linguist, it's very triggering. But this is true of any area where you have expertise. It's always easier to take like the hot take than it is to be informed. So with that said, if you're making content online, the same is true. So the article you're talking about, the LinkedIn piece, I actually invited readers to do a little bit of the data work themselves and just do a quick search on the hashtag feedback and just scan the first 50 that came back. And you'll see the pattern, right? I love these little data stories that allow you to just quickly validate yourself, what you're seeing. If you are providing anything that has real data in a pop accessible way, so you don't need to be a data scientist to consume it, and you are willing to partner that with a graphic that encapsulates the finding, it is a recipe for going viral. It is why I go viral several times a year, because if you can get it into 800 words, which is hard, and you can get it into the one chart, which is hard, everybody shares it because it's useful and it's different than vibes. It's different than, because in the vibes universe, people just share the stuff like maybe they happen to agree with, although most of that stuff doesn't really get shared because it doesn't add a lot of value. Like, oh, Barrett thinks that's cool. Okay, maybe I'll give it a like. I'm probably not going to share it,
Right. It's interesting to me because you found ways to package these things, to your point, which starts with selection in a way that makes it interesting to people. So even if it is data driven, which by default might make people's eyes glaze over, it's like, oh God, data. You're packaging it and selecting for topics that are going to engage people and then backing it up with, and here's the findings behind that. Like you're giving it substance. You don't just include charts though. One of the things that I noticed as I was reading through a bunch of the nerd processor pieces again is there's this one little quirky element that's just kind of fun, which is you do these digitally hand-drawn images in a lot of them, maybe all of them. Mm-hmm. Where did that come from? Why do you do that?
I used to have a blog many years ago called Django 1 Week at a Time, where I started drawing these little comics at the top of the blog. And it was by far the most popular part of the blog. And I missed having a vehicle for that. I'm not a great visual artist. I do a lot of handwritten stuff in Nerd Processor, right? Like a lot of my charts, I'll handwrite insights on top of. All of what I'm trying to do is make this, the fact that I really don't let them get longer than 1,000 words, so it doesn't feel like you're reading like a research piece. The fact that the graphics are really simple, they have sort of poppy colors, I handwrite, the comics that are there at the top, they're all really designed to make the content accessible to anybody. You won't feel stupid when you read it. Like there's something here I don't understand. Because the thing that mostly prevents people from using data is fear that they're not smart enough to internalize it. It feels like a lot of work. I don't want it to feel like a lot of work to read what I'm putting together. Those comics, for me, are like outlet. So there's a little character in all of them who is me with green eyes and dark hair. And, it's sort of like how I experience the world. And sometimes she is happy and doing great. And sometimes she's really bummed out. And there's always a connection between the comic and the content of the piece. I've gotten a lot of feedback about Nerd Processor this year, but I've now received 30 or 40 specific comments on the comics, and they always delight me more than any other feedback.
It's like
the tiny part of what I do, and I don't spend, I spend 10 minutes on it once a week, right? But it's so fun.
In episode 1 of the show, I had James Clear on, and James has become quite well known for his work. And at the bottom of his newsletter, which goes out to like 3 million people, one of the biggest newsletters in the world at this point, he's got a little PS, and it just links to a nothing burger of a Twitter post or like something funny. It's a side of his personality that comes out nowhere else really online, but that if you know him, you see it. And we talked about this, and he said, yeah, it's by far the most clicked on link in the whole thing.
Yeah,
it's just this little throwaway PS. And it's the same thing that I see in the comic, right? It adds this element of personality, reflects a part of who you are, it reflects your creative character. Like, I love it. So I had to ask about it. Thank you.
I love it too. And I would keep doing it even if everybody else hated it. And it was shown to drive down my engagement, I would still do it. That's how much I love doing them. So
That's
I've
called
thought
creative
about doing
license.
like, maybe I'll do it actually. I thought about doing an end of year. I have another couple of pieces before the end of the year, but I'm going to have one more piece this year that I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Maybe I'll make it an all comics edition for the
That
year
would be
end.
really
We'll
fun.
see.
I love that. I love that. One of the things you mentioned earlier when we were talking about kind of lessons learned or your performance as CEO of Textio was about hiring execs. And you have more experience with this than me, although I have an okay amount of experience with it. It is one of the hardest things to do, I think. And I think maybe, I don't know if it was Paul Graham or Mark Andreessen, one of those type of people, said something to the effect of, once you get an exec level person, one of the things you can be most assured of is that they are really good at bullshitting if they need to. And while I think that's a bit of a cynical take, I do think it's part of it is true. There's something true in it, in that you do have to be able to talk your way through things in a variety of situations once you hit a certain level in business. And that can make it really hard to evaluate execs. So I'm curious what you've learned about making really important kind of key hires in a business, even given the mistakes that you've made.
Yeah. I will say I never ever hired somebody bad into an executive role. Even the people who didn't work out were quite capable, even if they weren't right for the job I hired them for at Textio. So I'm going to say the less cynical version. I mean, surprise, I'm less cynical than Mark Andreessen. But I'm going to say the less cynical version, which is that by the time somebody has reached executive level in their career, they've actually accomplished a lot of stuff and they have real skills. And so the norm, even when an exec does not work out, is that they leave your organization still having made some important contributions, right? It's unlike maybe you hire an early career person who never shows up to work, you fire them and you're like, well, that was a disaster. Even an exec who's a disaster has done some really good things probably at your company. So I think it's important to say, like, this is part of why exec hiring is so hard, because by the time you're looking at exec candidates, they're all pretty good at many things. It's rarely binary, like good, not good. They're all pretty good at a bunch of things. The only thing that I found was a strong predictor. It's not 100% predictor, but I'm gonna claim it as maybe an 85 or 90% predictor of success in the exec job that I found to two parts. One is an interview process where you get to see their brain working. So I know that people are very big on the tell me about a time behavioral interviewing. I don't think it's adequate. I don't think it's adequate for any role, but I don't think it's adequate, especially for exec roles. So I eventually got to a stage where my first real conversation after basic screening with an exec I wanted to hire was, we had a 2-hour call and I would open the books on a bunch of data that was real about our company. And we would talk through it. And I would ask them questions about how they interpreted it. And they would tell me prior experiences where they'd seen similar patterns. And like, we would start to mind meld. And then eventually, once they came into loop with the team, I would give them tons of data. And I'd be like, your job is you're going to have this series of one-on-ones. By the way, before any of that, you're going to meet with your future team and you can ask them anything you want. You're running a team meeting. You can ask them for their perspective on anything, because it's important that we see how they show up in that setting. And then in the one-on-ones, I tell you what we're going to talk about. Like, you're a marketing leader, you're going to meet with the product leader and you're going to talk through like outlines of a plan for next year, right? I don't make you make one presentation, but I make you do this with every executive. And then in your final one-on-one with me, you're going to basically tell me your plan. And so it's wonderful because when people start on the job, they know exactly what job they're stepping into. They already have a head start on ramping, and I know who I'm probably getting. And you know how it feels to work together. And it's a tremendous amount of work. It's a tremendous amount of work. And so there are gates along the way. Usually by the time someone's going through the full process, you're pretty serious about them. Like, it's you, and they are, and they know what they're getting into. And so that, combined with this piece of feedback I got from Rachel Romer. So Rachel was the longtime CEO of Guild Education, stepped down last year, incredible leader. And when I was deciding in 2021, I was restaffing my exec team for the next wave. She was one of the people I called. And she was like, look, all these people are better at their functions than me. That's like a fact. And I'm going to talk to their prior CEOs and find out like just how good they are. Beyond that, the only thing I care about is growth mindset. Because what I know is that I am going to need to give them feedback. I need them to be able to embrace, welcome, solicit, seek feedback. And I know that things are going to go wrong. That's just like a law of companies. Things are going to go wrong. So I need people who I know from prior experience, they've like done the job. And I know from my experience that they take feedback well and know. And I was like, oh, she's like, it's really simple. People who do that have done really well. And people who don't, like people who can't, have not done well. And so I really incorporated that component in. And since I sort of implemented that, I think, hiring execs was like more like a 90% success rate than the industry standard of 50%, which is what I did the first time around. Where
That's
success
great.
means you stay in the job for like at least 18 months and do a good job.
Yeah. So there's 100 different topics that I could continue to drill down on. What I noticed when I was doing the research on you was that almost everyone interviews you as an expert, which I think is good for you, good for them, good for their audience, good for your brand. Also, it's hard to find your like story as a founder and as a person. So I wanted to do that version of the conversation. And so I actually want to turn back to the personal for a moment before we wrap up here. And one of the things that I really admire about you is you make time for things that matter to you outside of work too. Swimming, you're an athlete yourself, but one of the things I'm most fascinated by is you've been coaching youth basketball for a long time. And I wondered how that got started and what it's become for you, like how you look at that as an outlet for not just the young people that you're developing, but for you.
I love this. I wish I were a better basketball coach. I wish I were better at basketball. I'm a pretty good basketball coach. I started coaching basketball with my dad, with my younger sister's team when I was a teenager, right? I have a sister who's 8 years younger than I am, and I coached her team with my dad. And then I did that sort of at the YMCA recreationally for a while. Went away to college and I continued to do that. And I actually did it every year up until my own daughter was born. And then I stopped for a few years because you stop spending time with other people's children. You have your own baby.
Yeah.
And then she wanted to start playing when she was about 4. And fun fact, the first team she was ever on, which was a YMCA team, I co-coached with a woman named Kieran Bryant, who turns out her daughter was on the team. She was the CEO and president of the Seattle Storm, WNBA team in Seattle at the time. And now she runs the LA team. Like she went down and runs the LA team. So she's like big time. And I was like so much more competitive. I learned so much from her about how to work with little kids because she was so positive all the time. And I'm like, let's get him in the layups, and she was great. But then, yeah, I got more and more serious about it. And this past year, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. So okay, I have one kid who plays. I had 3 who did play. I have 1 who still plays. Although, Barrett, you're getting late breaking news here. That kid has just shifted from club basketball to club volleyball.
Oh, no.
Breaks my heart, but it's so joyful to watch her find her thing. She still plays basketball, but like she just made the switch. Like this is hot news in the last couple of weeks. She just cut over. She's like, I'm all in on volleyball. Okay. But she got too good for me to coach her. Like she got too competitive. She's a really good athlete. And so I started coaching again younger kids, and she was my assistant coach. And in fact, over the summer, I actually started like a competitive AAU tournament team. Like for the first time, I was coaching at that level, and I took a bunch of girls I had coached in school. I love it. I love it. I could talk about this forever. Literally, of all the things we've talked about, my favorite moment of this year, like true favorite moment of this year, is there's a little girl, and I mean little, she's tiny, that was on my school team last year, and she wanted to play in the summer and on the competitive team. And I talked to her mom, and I was like, oh boy, I'm like worried she's going to get killed, but like I'll make space for her, but she might not get a lot of playing time. And she's like, okay. Anyway, this girl, very gritty, she's very tough, not super athletic, very gritty, very tough. Somehow, by some miracle, and it's on video, she converted on a fast break over the summer. And at this age, the teams are still inclusive by default. So it doesn't matter that she's not the best athlete. Her teammates are still passing to her. They were 10 and 11 years old. And somehow the teammate hit her with the pass, and she brought it in, and she got the and one. She was fouled. By the way, she missed the free throw by like 6 feet because she can't hit the basket. But she scored. And like for that kid, that's going to be a top 10 moment of her youth. That is not a kid who's going to probably play varsity basketball in high school. And at the end of the summer, when I was talking to her dad, he was like, look, like this was a big deal for her. Last year, she had a hard time socially at school. And now she's starting the fall feeling like she has 7 friends. It was like, Oh, that's why I do that, right? Like, and so especially with girls at that age, like I don't know what that girl's gonna do, but whatever she gets serious about, she's gonna kill it. You know what I mean? Like she is tough, she is persevering, she's willing to put herself out there. And so like you get the opportunity to help shape that. And then to get to do it with my daughter as the assistant coach, like I did with my parent, is magical. So I love it. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Greatest moment of my year. I've watched that video clip like 30 times for sure, at least.
It's so cool. I know I'm disappointed. We won't have time to get into all of the things I want to ask you about parenting because there's so many I'd love to ask. But I just want to reflect back to you that I read this one story that you shared in one interview about a conversation you had around the dinner table with one of your daughters about grit. You were just talking about grit and how she was listening to the conversation. You were going back and forth. And at the end, she said something to the effect of basically, you're a great example of that. And I love that a person like you takes the time to be that kind of role model, not just to your girls, but also to every year, another cohort of young girls are coming through your team and getting to see that example from you and learn that from you is just fantastic. Like,
Thank
what
you.
a gift.
They give me a gift because some people are really good at meditation. I am not. It's hard for me to shut off the monologue in my head. Being in the gym with 10, 11-year-olds for an hour is super meditative for me because there's nowhere I can be other than present. And it's almost nothing I do has that same impact for me where it just fully takes my mind to a place of rest.
Yeah.
I'm engaged, but my mind, it quiets like the demons and the monologue. And so I feel like it's a gift to get to spend time with them. And I truly think if the world were run by like 5th and 6th grade girls, it would be a really good place. That's like peak humanity, in my opinion.
That's awesome. Well, my 2 closing questions are always the same. And the first one is, what is the most beautiful version of the future that you are working to build?
I mean, I'm really glad you just asked this about the girls that I work with, because to me, I have 3 teenage girls, right? I have a daughter who's a 9th grader and I have stepdaughters who are 10th and 8th grade. So we got like a real cluster of girl. And for all of them, I watched them go from elementary school through middle school. In elementary school, all of them were like pretty self-possessed, pretty confident, and they're pretty good for teenagers. But in middle school, things start to get shaky for kids, certainly for girls. If you want to give podcast listeners anyone to check out, it should be a child psychologist named Lisa Damore, who wrote a great book called The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. Cannot recommend it enough. But to me, if we can get girls through to adulthood believing and expecting that they can start companies, that they can be athletes, that they can have voices, especially right now in this country, that's a hard thing to continue to believe. And so I feel it's like of all the things I do, if you can set girls up for leadership where they just expect that's how it works, I think a lot of good things come from that. And if you can set boys up to expect that's how it works, which is actually, I think, harder, that's the most important future I can imagine.
I love that. One of the greatest gifts I've ever received in my life is being raised by a mom who was the breadwinner and a leader at work. And it just completely shaped my worldview in that exact way. And I'm very grateful for that, because I don't know that there would be any other way to come to the set of beliefs I have about that if I hadn't had that aspect. Okay, my last question is, who are you becoming as you do the work that you do?
I think I've become more balanced. And I think I have much less tolerance for stuff that's not important. I don't know how else to say it. Like going from a place where like you have to get from the good story to the true story is an evolution. I have always been viewed as being like a pretty aggressive person. I have a big personality. I think I've just become much more straightforward. I'm just much more straightforward, and I appreciate straightforwardness. And I don't know if it's like an age thing, if it's like the Zen you have to channel to parent teenagers, if it's, I don't know what it is, but I feel less noise. And so I hope to create less noise. And so I think, simpler, more straightforward, I think is probably my next wave, whatever form that takes professionally.
I love that. Well, Kieran, this has been wonderful 2 hours together. Every time I spend time with you, I'm grateful for it. But this has been really special. So thanks for doing it with me.
Yeah, so much fun. I enjoyed this too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Work. My name's Barrett Brooks. I'm your host, and this podcast is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. If you have a podcast or you have a friend who has a podcast that's looking for an excellent producer, I'd love it if you check them out. They're an exceptional service provider, and I just love giving them a shout out at the end of the show. My guest today was Kieran Snyder. If you enjoyed this conversation, I have a bunch more like it in the feed, and I have a new one that comes out every Tuesday. So make sure, if you haven't already, to hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that every new episode will drop right into your feed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. If you'd like to follow up and learn more about Kieran's work, the company she built is called Textio, which you can find at textio.com. Her newsletter on surprising but true data-driven stories about the world of work is at nerdprocessor.com. Fantastic. I love reading every one of them that comes out. And of course, you can follow Kieran on social media. She's especially active on LinkedIn and X. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd consider leaving a review. It helps other people find it. All the podcast apps love it when you leave a review because, I don't know, the algorithm. I'd also love it if you left a comment on YouTube and told me what you think, or a question in the Spotify feed that I'll follow up and answer if you leave one there. But even more importantly than reviews, or questions, or comments, which are all awesome, if you really enjoyed today's episode, grab the link in whatever app that you listened to it in or watched it in and drop it into a text message and just send it to one friend. Honestly, that's the best thing you can do to help spread the show to new listeners, which helps me be encouraged, helps me continue having the motivation to keep making the show. So thanks so much for doing that. I appreciate you helping spread the word. All of your support in 2024 was incredible. So thank you. All right, that's all I got for you today. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you spending 2 hours with me on every episode. I know that that's a long time, and I'm grateful that you choose to allocate your time this way. So thanks for being here, and I'll see you on the next episode.